Hi, my name is Brendan, and I'm an intern here at Blessings Christian Church. And today, this is the third and final Vespers message that I'll be giving. I'm so grateful to Pastor Bill for having me around this summer, and I could learn so much from him about the job of ministry. The message today is on Article 33, which covers the sacraments. Sacraments are Christian rituals which define and inform our identity as Christians. And there's some skepticism in society today about rituals partly because one of the cultural narratives around us is telling us to live authentic lives as individuals. And this means that they find rituals, which are often done in community, to be empty and meaningless. But one thing I'd like to suggest today is that all of our lives, whether we're Christian or non-Christian, are defined by rituals. And so one example of this in terms of nationality is the ritual of the television program Hockey Night in Canada. It's something that happens every Saturday night, and so it's something that has defined Canadian identity for decades, so much so that the host of Hockey Night in Canada, Ron MacLean, has said that if you want to show someone what it means to be a Canadian, you should sit them down in front of a TV on Saturday night. But if you're not a hockey fan, another ritual that might inform and define your identity is our family rituals. So, for example, when families grow and develop, they establish their own traditions, and some of these might be like getting pizza every Friday night, or camping over the same long weekend every summer. And so these are things that form our identities. They're habits that we learn that teach us how to live. And today we're also going to look at a sign or symbol in the Old Testament story of Israel. Israel was called to be a contrast community to the nations around them. And routinely what they did to reinforce their own identity was reenact great moments of history in their lives. For example, when they celebrated Passover, the Feast of Booths. But our story today comes from Joshua chapter 4. And the context of this story is that the Israelites have been delivered from Egypt, and they have received promises from God about the promised land. And they've wandered in the desert for 40 years, and finally now they've arrived at the doorstep of the promised land, and they're waiting to cross. And so God parts the waters of the Jordan River in order to help them get across. And having done that, he tells them to set up a sign, a memorial of 12 stones on the other side of the Jordan, so that when their children ask them, then they can tell them about what God has done in their lives. And in the New Testament, in Jesus, we're given new identities. And with this new identity, we're also given new rituals, the rituals of baptism and the Lord's Supper. And so in this message, I'm going to identify three things about the rituals of baptism and the Lord's Supper that make us into a contrast community. They make us look strange to today's society. And the first thing is that these rituals indicate that we believe in a God who works personally in history. He is a personal God who works in history. Second, we believe that these rituals incorporate us into a new community, one which transcends all other social ties. And third, these rituals revolve around a person, the person of Jesus Christ. And so the first point is that we believe in a personal God who works in history. And this is distinctive because we live in a society today where two beliefs are common. The first would be that God doesn't exist at all, and so this notion of him working in history must be an illusion. The second belief that is prevalent today that makes this uncommon or that makes this a distinctive belief, is that those who do believe in God often see that the best or only way to experience him is through personal experience and introspection. And so the notion of experiencing God in real time in community is very distinctive. But the story from Joshua 4 teaches us that God works powerfully in the midst of the community, and so I'm going to read the first 7 verses of Joshua chapter 4, which describes the establishment of this memorial. When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Choose 12 men from among the people, 1 from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight." So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, 1 from each tribe, and said to them, "Go over before the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever." And so this story from Joshua 4 teaches us that God works powerfully in the midst of a community who expects divine intervention and sees it in real time before them. They do not assume that they live in a world unaffected by the supernatural, but in fact that God works powerfully in their lives in real time. This episode parallels the New Testament sacraments in a way that is instructive for us, which is that the action of God of dividing the waters of the Jordan precedes the sign of the 12 stones. First, God parts the Jordan River, and after they cross, they establish these stones on the other side. And in baptism, God is the primary actor, he's the primary agent, and first he adopts us as his children, incorporates us into his family, giving us new promises and uniting us with Jesus. And the waters of baptism represent and confer upon us a new identity. And so when we see a baptism at church, we are watching God act in a child's life in real time. And the Lord's Supper, during the Lord's Supper, Christ nourishes us at his table, and so we receive grace from him. And the reason this is not an empty or meaningless ritual is because this ritual is grounded in his death and resurrection. It is a celebration of his death and resurrection, and a celebration of his victory over sin. And in both of these sacraments, we can be sure of their effectiveness because of the one who's making the promises, that God is making these promises to us. So the second thing that we learn from the sacraments about how we are to live as a contrast community is that they incorporate us into a community that transcends all other social ties. And this notion is countercultural for a couple of reasons. First reason is that the notion of community at all is very distinctive among the cultural narrative around us of expressive individualism. And the story in Joshua 4 shows us that Israel was most authentic as a community, sharing stories with each other of God's work in their lives. So where expressive individualism tells us that in order to be authentic, we must have self-expression and express ourselves, Israel sees it as, our authentic identity is actually found in community. And Joshua says, these are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. And when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground, for the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you, until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea, when he dried it up until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. So we see in this story a community of believers who routinely tell each other about the great works of God in their life. And that's a point of application for us today, especially in this moment of uncertainty, that we ought to tell each other of the works of God in our lives, the ways that he has worked in our lives. And the second reason that this notion of community is countercultural because of another cultural narrative around us, the one of increasing political polarization between right and left and identity politics. And what this cultural narrative is telling us is that if you do not toe the party line, if you affirm any one thing about the opposite party, you're a heretic and you're excluded from that community. But what the sacraments teach us is that they are actually part of the most important and inclusive community. First, because in the sacrament of baptism, it teaches us that anyone can be baptized and anyone can become a Christian. It is not restricted to any class or race or gender. The second thing is that when we celebrate the Lord's Supper, we all come to the Lord's table as redeemed sinners. And this means that the Lord's Supper table is the great equalizer. All other social bonds, bonds of family, bonds of politics, bonds of group identity are all subjugated beneath the identity that we have together as brothers and sisters in Christ. And so there's another point of application here, which is that when we are part of a community which transcends all other communities and goes deeper than all of those communities, it means that we should be able to talk to each other in a way that reflects that. It means that if we disagree with each other about whether or not to wear masks, if we disagree with each other about how we should return to church, we should still recognize that we are united to each other in Christ, and this should inform all of our conversations with grace. And the third thing that these rituals show us is that this community revolves around a single person. They revolve around the person of Jesus. And this is countercultural because these other group identities, communities like nationality, communities of group identity, of politics, first, they don't revolve around a person, they revolve often around ideology. Expressive individualism revolves around the self, or they revolve around a common utopian goal. And in the Old Testament story with Joshua and the Israelites, it wasn't exactly a community that revolved around Jesus, but it was a community that revolved around Yahweh, which is the name for God in the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, Jesus is Yahweh in the flesh. He's Yahweh incarnate. And if this is a claim that you're skeptical of, there's a Vespers message a couple weeks ago that I did that speaks a little bit about that. But instead of being initiated in the New Testament into a community, instead of being initiated into a community by adopting a certain political stance or a set of beliefs, we're initiated by the waters of baptism. And instead of participating in a community by joining in online mockery of political opponents or of participating in cancel culture, we participate in the community of Christ by celebrating his victory over sin at his table, where we are all equally brothers and sisters in Christ. And so these Christian rituals of baptism and Lord's Supper remove the focus from the self and remove the focus from the other, and they place focus on Christ, in whom our hopes are set. And so in conclusion, we learn three things from these Christian rituals which make us into a contrast community. First, we learn that we believe in a personal God who acts in history. Second, we learn that they incorporate us into a new community which transcends all other social ties. And third, they find their meaning and their substance in the person of Jesus, in whom our hopes are set. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you have a wonderful week.